When Edgar Allan Poe was 18 years old, he published the lines, "Thy soul shall find itself alone mid dark thoughts of the gray tombstone. Not one in all the crowd to pry into thine hour of secrecy." The poem is the spirits of the dead. And if you've read it, which I know you have, Poe writes about how the spirits of the dead who are in life before thee are again in death around thee, and their will shall overshadow thee. Be still. Well, these are the gray tombstones that Poe would have known as a teenager. He spent many a day and many a night wandering Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. And that's exactly what we're going to do on this brisk autumn day. So why don't you join me? Well, Shockoe Hill Cemetery opened in 1822. That's the same year Poe's wife Virginia was born. This was after the city's burial grounds at St. John's Church, where Poe's mother is buried, were full. So there was need of a new burial grounds. This spot was selected because it was far enough outside the city. Poe lived way down that direction. At the time, about 14th and Tobacco Alley. We're about 5th and Hospital Streets. A valley separated Shockoe Hill Cemetery from the rest of the city. So 2 years after the cemetery opened, it received this burial. This is the grave of Poe's first love, Jane Stith Craig Stannard, the woman he called the first purely ideal love of my soul. As the story goes, he was 14 years old. At the first sight of her, he could hardly breathe. He was speechless. He almost fainted right at her feet, which would have been guaranteed to make a great first impression. He fell head over heels for this woman, but she was unattainable. Because he was 14, she was his best friend's mother, so it wouldn't have really worked out. But poets like unrequited love. They like to worship somebody from afar. And the poem To Helen that he dedicates her, he deems her as Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman who ever lived. But even at the end of the poem, he can only get close enough to see her standing statue-like in her window niche. There's always going to be a gulf between them. Just think of the imagery from the first stanza. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, which gently o'er the perfume sea the weary, wayworn wanderer bore to his own native shore. Her beauty is like the ship pulling across the ocean back home to the glory that was Greece, to the grandeur that was Rome. But it wasn't to be. She contracted tuberculosis or some other disease. She died quickly when he was 15 years old. And it's said that he kept a vigil for a while at this grave, camping out night after night just to be near her. Like many Poe legends, we can't be entirely certain if it's true or if this is just something that he told people. He had a way of creating the Poe legend about himself. But this has long been a site for Poe's admirers to visit. So for the first anniversary of the museum, it was 1923, and John Wooster Robinson, a wealthy Poe collector and the head of a mental hospital from Livermore, California, commissioned this plaque to be placed on her grave. It was a great way to celebrate the museum's first anniversary. And the museum invited 3 U.S. presidents. There was Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Warren G. Harding, the current president. Of course, they declined, and Harding said, I can't be there. I'm planning on going out west on a tour. So Harding left, went out west, and died. If he'd come here instead to the safety of Shockoe Hill Cemetery, he might still be alive today. Same thing with Taft and Wilson. They're also dead. But this is the plaque right here at the bottom. It's not from the poem to Helen. It's from the Valley Niece, a early version of the Valley of Unrest. It reads, Helen, like thy human eye, there the uneasy violets lie, there the reedy crest doth wave o'er the old forgotten grave, one by one from the tree top, there the eternal dews do drop. So he believed that this poem referenced this grave that Poe used to visit. Although it says it's an old forgotten grave, and when Poe visited here, the grave would have been brand new. And it's not really in a valley, it's actually on a hill above the valley. But aside from that, it's the thought that counts. And Robertson went all out. If the poem mentions violets on the grave, he's going to put violets here. And he sent 100 California violets to be planted on this grave. And there are so many violets, there's too many violets to plant on the grave. So the Poe Museum had to write him back and say, there's too many violets. Can we take some of them home with us so they don't go to waste? And now we see that none of the violets have survived for this past century. But the monument still does. And right behind you over there, that's the grave of her son, one of Poe's best friends, Robert Craig Stannard, who grew up to become a judge. And he actually loaned Poe about $200 to help furnish his house. And on Poe's bankruptcy petition, he lists Robert Stannard there as one of his creditors. The year after Jane Stannard died, another important person in Poe's childhood was laid to rest, right here. It's William Galt, Poe's foster father John Allen's wealthy uncle. He was the import-export business and a leader of the merchant class in Richmond society, despised by the planter class, the aristocracy, who called him the old skinflint. But he was vital to Poe's childhood for a couple of reasons. First, because when John Allen's business was suffering, he was able to bail him out and buy his house. And just as important, when he died, he left the bulk of his considerable fortune to John Allen, who bought one of the nicest mansions in Richmond called Moldavia, as well as a summer house out in Goochland County. So Poe was finally able to live in high style from the time he was 16 until he went off to the University of Virginia. Of course, Poe didn't inherit any of this. But it's still an important marker and somebody who played a pivotal role in Poe's childhood. This, in fact, is the Allen family plot. And this is the grave I'd like to show you next, right back here. This is the grave of Poe's beloved foster mother, Frances Valentine Allen. When Poe's biological mother, Eliza Poe, was suffering from tuberculosis, in her final days in a Richmond boarding house, her acting troupe advertised in the paper that they needed the humane hearts of Richmond to come and aid this desperate person in her final days. And even though she was a member of the planter class, the wealthy elite, she organized a group of her friends to start bringing meals to Mrs. Poe, although Mrs. Poe was an actress, somebody that you typically wouldn't associate with if you're a member of a higher class. But somehow she met little Edgar and was infatuated with this little 2-year-old boy. And when Poe's mother died, a month before his 3rd birthday, she talked her husband into taking him in. Mr. Allen right here. They didn't have any children, at least she didn't have any children. He already had children running around town with other women, was already putting some of them through school and buying them clothes, keeping them secret from his wife. Even included a couple of them in his will. In the will, he says that some lady says they were mine, but they still deserve something, but never included Edgar in the will. So Poe had his differences with Mr. Allen, but he adored Frances Allen. And she gave him the comfort that he could, although she was often unwell and very often had to go to the Springs to recover from different maladies. And there was little she could do to protect her from John Allen's anger. Often when Allen back here was angry with Poe, according to one of his friends, he would threaten to send him adrift. So I think that Frances here is the one that stood between these two very volatile tempers and maintained peace in the house. Unfortunately, it all came to a head when Poe was 18 and he decided to leave the Allen house forever, to storm out. And while he was away from home, 2 years later, he was enlisted in the U.S. military at Fort Monroe. Not too far from here, down the James River, and he heard that Frances Allen was dying. She had consumption. Her last wish was that she could see her darling Eddie one more time. Unfortunately, he made it back here a day late for the funeral. It's said that just seeing how close her grave was to Jane Stander's, just over there, he was overcome with grief, weeping on this spot. This is the closest thing he had to a mother growing up. And a few years later, he wrote that of all the trials he's faced, that the want of parental affection was the heaviest of his trials. Now let's take a look back here at her husband, John Allen, who's got a much bigger stone. So this is the grave of Poe's foster father, John Allen, a wealthy Scottish-born tobacco merchant who settled in Richmond in his teen years and was helped along the way by his wealthy childless uncle, William Galt, over there. And although he was a member of the merchant class, which was rapidly on the rise here in Richmond, he was able to marry a member of the planter class, a little bit higher class than he was, and to purchase a mansion called Moldavia, which belonged previously to Molly and David Randolph. Now, the Randolphs were of the planter class related to the Jeffersons, John Marshall, the Lees, very well-connected family. They've been here for centuries. So people sort of thought these merchants were taking over their possessions, and they didn't really belong in a place like Moldavia. And Poe, of course, growing up there, doubly felt like he didn't belong because he was always reminded he wasn't really part of the Allen family. He never took on Allen as a last name. He only had as a middle name, and was often reminded by Mr. Allen that he was only dependent upon his charity. Frances Allen, as I mentioned, just adored Edgar, but Mr. Allen often was at odds with him. He complained in some of his letters that Poe was sulky, ill-tempered, disrespectful, doesn't show a spark of gratitude for all the charity I've shown him all these years. There's just not one good thing about that boy. Even this letter to Poe's brother wrote that maybe he picked the wrong son. Maybe he should have taken the brother because he turned out so much better. And also complained that Poe should have been nicer to his sister, or at least she's half his sister. So Allen here is implying that he's not quite sure who Rosalie Poe's father is. But it all went downhill when it's time for Poe to go to college. He went off to the University of Virginia, the most expensive school in the country. And it was an innovative new school founded by Thomas Jefferson. Poe was only the second class to ever attend. And Jefferson decided that students should be able to choose their own curriculum, pick out which classes they want to take. And Poe, still with this idea, he wanted to be a poet. So that meant, realistically, he wasn't going to make a living as a poet. He's probably going to be a lawyer or a professor. So he studied ancient and modern languages. And Allen here wouldn't pay. He gave him a third of the money he needed to pay his tuition and room and board. And Poe started begging for money. Even couldn't afford a French book for his French class. Asked Mr. Allen for a French textbook. Allen sent him an arithmetic book saying, this is what you should be studying. You should take over the tobacco export business, not waste your time studying languages. So after the first year, Poe was heavily in debt. He started borrowing from local money lenders, and then he turned to gambling. And the expenses for the year were about $350. That's expensive. His salary at the Southern Literary Messenger a decade later was about $500. So after 1 year, he was $2,000 in debt, at least, mostly from his gambling. He was never able to pay that off. He came back home to live under Mr. Allen's roof, but they argued so violently that eventually Poe stormed out, said, "I'm determined to quit this place and find some place in this wide world where I'll be treated not as you've treated me." And that's when he wrote back the next day saying, "Oh, by the way, I kind of need some money. I can't afford to run away from home, but if you send me some money, then I'll run away from home." And Poe eventually stowed away aboard a coal ship that took him to Norfolk. Then he headed up to Boston, where he published his first book at the age of 18. It didn't sell. It wasn't even distributed. There were only about 50 copies printed. So he decided, what would Lord Byron do? Byron was his hero, and he'd gone off to join the Greeks in their battle for independence. So Poe enlisted in the U.S. Army. And in 2 years' time, he'd made it from a private to a regimental sergeant major, which usually took about 17 years to do. So he ascended at a rapid rate. He did so well that he decided, I'm pretty good at this. I should be an officer. So he needed help to get out of his enlistment and get into the United States Military Academy at West Point. And this might not have happened had not Mrs. Allen passed away, and John Allen and Poe briefly reconciled, and he helped Poe get letters of recommendations from important people like Powhatan Ellis, who was U.S. Senator, and General Winfield Scott. And Poe did get an appointment to West Point. But while he was at West Point, unbeknownst to him, John Allen remarried to this woman, Louisa G Allen of Paterson, New Jersey. And to make matters worse, they got married in New York, and Poe was in New York State at West Point, and they hadn't even told him. So he was insulted, he was furious. He wrote an angry letter to Allen about this, but also Poe must have realized that slight connection he had to the Allen family, that was about to be lost. He had no chance of becoming an heir to Allen's fortune if she had kids. In fact, she had 3 sons. They're buried right back here. And they became the legitimate heirs to Allen's fortune. And Poe decided he did not want to be at West Point anymore. He had to get out. But he wrote to Allen saying, "I'm not allowed to resign without my guardian's permission. So please give me permission to resign." And with Allen's silence, Poe decided the only way to get out was to get expelled. So he stopped showing up to class, disobeyed orders, pulled all sorts of pranks, and finally he got himself court-martialed for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders, and he got kicked out of West Point. The cadets there loved him. They chipped in and they helped him publish a book of his poetry. Unfortunately, they thought it was going to be a funny book with all sorts of silly verses lampooning their commanding officers. Instead, it was a bunch of poetry like "The sleeper, oh, the lady sleeps, soft around her the worms creep," and Tamerlane and Alaraf, Israfel, an early version of Lenore, not the kind of funny stuff they were looking for. So they threw most of their copies in the Hudson River just to get rid of them. And even the copy at the Poe Museum, the cadet who got it scrawled obscenities on the front page because of how much he hated it. And that was kind of the last straw between Poe and Allen. Poe would write letters from Baltimore asking for his assistance, and Allen sometimes helped along the way, but more often than not didn't even reply. Now, this is said that the last time that Poe saw Allen was shortly before his death. He came back to Richmond with the aim of reconciling with him. He stopped by Moldavia. Mrs. Allen had no idea who this guy was and wouldn't let him into the house, so Poe argued with her until he finally forced his way into the house, up the stairs. And Allen refused to speak to him, refused to see him, shook his cane at him, says, "Get out, I never want to see you again." And that was their last contact. Allen died not too long after that, sitting in his armchair, his 3 sons very young discovered him, and as I mentioned, he left most of his fortune to his legitimate sons. But he also had those illegitimate sons that I mentioned. And one of the things that I really like about the positioning of her grave is that if you turn around that direction, probably no more than 10, 15 meters as the raven flies, we come upon the grave of one of John Allen's mistresses, Elizabeth Wills. Just after Mr. Allen's death, some of his friends acknowledged that he did have a weakness for women, and it was one of his unfortunate sins. Now, some of these affairs he had between the 2 wives, so maybe they could be forgiven. In fact, it seems that the second Mrs. Allen accepted the 2 illegitimate children because they were conceived between relationships. But some people still think that part of the reason why Poe and Allen disagreed so much was because Poe knew, he heard about some of these extramarital affairs, which would have been a great insult to Poe as well as to his beloved foster mother. But from here, let's take a look back this way at a very unusual and interesting resident. Now, this isn't your typical monument. This is a boulder from Capitol Hill in Boston, placed here for a woman who seemingly had no friends left here in Richmond. But she was beloved in the North. In fact, the President of the United States, Grant, made her Postmistress General of Richmond, and thanks for all of her service to the Union during the Civil War. She was the Union spy, Elizabeth Van Lew. Although she came from a prominent family, she was a vocal abolitionist as early as the 1840s, and a friend of Poe's. He lectured at her house, supposedly on animal magnetism. I think it's just as likely he lectured about the universe, since that was something he was frequently lecturing about at the time. But she also kept tabs on him. She was a neighbor of Poe's last fiancée, Elmyra R Shelton, and according to one of their mutual acquaintances, Susan and Archer Tally Weiss, she used to watch him walking up and down the street past her house. Maybe those sharp observation skills served her well during the war. Now, during the Civil War, you couldn't be extremely vocal about your abolitionist tendencies. So she decided her tactic was to act a little bit eccentric. They called her Crazy Bet Van Lew. But in the midst of acting mad, she let one of her servants work in the White House of Confederacy. Now, at the time, slaves were not allowed to read or write. It was illegal. But this former slave, she taught to read and write. So while she was there, she was memorizing everything that Jefferson Davis and the Confederate generals were saying to each other, and writing it all down, giving it to Van Lew, who is sneaking the messages across enemy lines using all sorts of tactics like invisible ink. It sounds like something out of Poe's The Gold Bug, doesn't it? They even say she would hollow out eggs and hide the little message inside the eggs. She would go out pretending that she's sitting by the canal talking to birds. Really, she's just watching to see what Confederate ships are coming and going, and passing that information all along. So her real claim to fame isn't her acquaintance with Poe, it's her service to the Union during the Civil War. And it just so happens our next stop is right back there. The grave of Poe's first and last fiancée. As much as I love to see all the gifts and tributes people leave for Elmyra R Shelton. They're leaving him on the wrong grave. This is her husband's grave. She's right there. This marker was placed in 2012 on the actual site of Sarah Elmyra Royster Shelton's grave. She was his first fiance. When he was about 15 years old, they met, they fell in love. There's descriptions of them walking along the canal together, playing the same keyboard together. But Poe's an orphan, an actress's kid. He's not really going to inherit anything. So her father, a pretty well-off merchant, decided he wasn't good enough for his daughter. So he determined to keep them apart, forbade her to see him. So that's when Poe and Elmyra started sneaking away to a little walled garden on Franklin Street. And they made plans to get married. As soon as he graduated college, he could take care of himself. He could do whatever he wanted. So when he was 17, he took off to the University of Virginia. But he wrote her love letters faithfully. And just as faithfully, her father intercepted them. Convinced her that that old Edgar Poe must have forgotten about you. You should marry somebody more suitable. And there was a slightly older, richer gentleman named Alexander Barrett Shelton, the guy who's buried right there. He had a shipping business on the canal. He invested heavily in Churchill real estate. So he was a good match. And by all accounts, it was a happy marriage. They were attractive. They were outgoing. They were a frequent sight at local balls. They had 4 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. And things seemed to be going well until one summer, a man was drowning in the canal, and Alexander Shelton there jumped in the water to rescue him, pulled him to safety, but contracted pneumonia afterwards. But before his death, he left a stipulation in his will protecting her from gold diggers who might try to marry her for a fortune, knowing that back then, the laws, in the United States at least, were that if a woman remarried, her husband got all of her possessions. So her husband left a stipulation to protect her by saying that if she remarried, she'd lose most of the fortune. She'd give up those rights. Years later, Poe returned to Richmond. This is after his wife had died, and he showed up at her house one day out of the blue. She saw him, and the first thing she said to him after having not seen him in over a decade was, "Go away, I gotta go to church. I don't miss church for anything." So he left. He came back the next summer, trying even harder to court her. He visited her again, convinced her that they needed to be married and married right away. He said that a love that hesitates is no love at all. And she said that if you're not willing to accept a maybe or a I need some time to think about it, then you're just gonna have to leave. So eventually Poe made a sacrifice. He joined the Sons of Temperance here in Richmond and pledged never to touch alcohol again. And I think maybe that had something to do with her finally accepting his proposal, which she did right around September 20th or 22nd or so. She wrote a letter to Poe's mother-in-law. Remember, Poe's mother-in-law, Mariah Clem, was still living up in the Bronx. She was a widow, and when Poe married, she would end up living with Poe. So Elmyra wrote to her and said, "I look forward to calling you mother. I'm fully prepared to love you. And by the way, I saw your daughter Virginia once at a party shortly after Edgar and Virginia married, and the feeling of seeing those two together was agonizing. And finally, I had to chase those thoughts of myself as if they were a venomous reptile and remind myself I was a married woman." So she actually wrote this in a letter to Poe's mother-in-law and Virginia's mother. And about this same time, Poe gave her a little gold engagement ring that's still at the Poe Museum today with his name engraved on the inside. So according to most accounts, they were set to get married on October 17th, 1849, after he went up north to do an editing job in Philadelphia, stopped by New York to pick up Mariah Clem and bring her back down here for the wedding. Of course, you know how that went. He died 10 days before they would have married. She never remarried after that. For the longest time, she refused interviews. All the Poe biographers were coming to Annie Richmond and Sarah Helen Whitman and Stella Lewis, asking for information. What was Poe like? What's the inside scoop? But she turned these down time and time again. It wasn't until her later years that she finally said, oh, he was the dearest thing into the world to me, that we really were engaged. She'd even been denying that they're engaged for a while. And according to a couple different accounts, she said that Poe told her that she was the real Annabel Lee. Of course, there were a couple other people who thought they were Annabel Lee too. There's Stella Lewis and Sarah Helen Whitman, Annie Richmond. But a lot of people think the best contender is probably Poe's wife, Virginia. But still, there are several people who still believe that that city by the sea was Richmond. And those lines, she was a child and I was a child, and this kingdom by the sea, refer to them growing up in Richmond together. And that's why right here on the monument it says, first and last fiancée of the poet Edgar Allan Poe, she was a child and I was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. Of course, Elmyra Shelton died almost 4 decades after Edgar Allan Poe, so that would seem to rule out the possibility of her being a perfect match for his Annabel Lee. Elsewhere in this cemetery, you'll find the final resting places of several other people who were important to Poe's life, including Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, who attended church services at Monumental Church, so Poe would have seen him as a youth. Also, Eliza White, the daughter of Thomas Willis White, owner of the Southern Literary Messenger, a magazine that Poe edited from 1835 until 1837. Poe might also have dedicated his poem To Eliza to her. After first dedicating it to his cousin Eliza Herring, and before he rededicated it to Frances Sargent Osgood. Elsewhere in the cemetery, you'll find the graves of John Hampton Pleasance, a Richmond journalist, and his brother Hugh Pleasance, who gave Poe a place to stay during the poet's next to last visit to the city. And as you stroll these grounds, you'll also be following the footsteps of Poe himself. According to his mother-in-law, there is nothing he enjoyed more than taking his wife Virginia on Sunday afternoon strolls through this peaceful cemetery, where he would invariably point out the grave of his beloved Helen. And this concludes our brief tour of Richmond's Shockoe Hill Cemetery. Be sure to visit for yourself, and maybe you'll find yourself alone mid dark thoughts of these gray tombstones.